The CEO's son lost his memory and stubbornly insisted that I was his first boyfriend. Now, he's living in my house, sneaking into my bed, and kissing me like it's the most natural thing in the world. I dared not resist. After all, his amnesia was entirely my fault. To keep my job, I had no choice but to play along, even going as far as bending over and taking on the submissive role he seemed to expect. But just when he was about to explore the deepest secrets of my body, his memory suddenly came rushing back. Welcome to History Channel. Subscribe to follow all our latest adventures. Story begins. Day 185 as a corporate drone, and I managed to commit a catastrophe of epic proportions. The boss assigned me to pick up his only son, freshly returned from studying abroad, from the airport. But thanks to my subpar driving skills, I ended up crashing us, and his heir, into a utility pole. While I escaped unscathed, the young master, Albert Layton, hit his head and passed out cold, a nasty bump swelling on his forehead. Panicking, I crawled over, trembling from head to toe, and resorted to performing CPR. Just as my lips touched his, Albert's eyes fluttered open, staring dazedly at me. "Are you my boyfriend?" he asked weakly. I froze, immediately pulling back and shaking my head furiously. Albert's unfocused gaze lingered on me, his voice faint but laced with reproach. "If you're not my boyfriend, why were you kissing me? And on the street, no less. Shameless." My face turned crimson as I scrambled to explain, but before I could get a word out, he groaned in pain, clutching his head. "Hospital first," he ordered with a wince. Good news. Albert Layton was as physically robust as a yak and survived with no major injuries. Bad news. His brain didn't fare as well. He had amnesia. Albert forgot everything about his life, except for one inexplicable belief. I was his boyfriend. His first boyfriend, no less. "If we're not dating," he argued one day, "why would I lower myself to ride in your Benz? I've never sat in such a cheap car before." I clutched the hem of my shirt, muttering, "It's not mine. It's the company's." Albert's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't even afford a Benz? And I still kissed you? Good heavens, I must have hit my head harder than I thought, falling for a pauper like you." I shrank into myself, muttering under my breath, "You really did break your brain." Albert's gaze darkened, and in a move more domineering than his father, he grabbed my chin, forcing me to meet his eyes. "As my first love, I'll overlook your flaws. Now, take me home." I couldn't wrap my head around his logic but was too terrified of him reporting me to his father. Reluctantly, I nodded. "Which home are you referring to?" Everyone in the company knew the boss spoiled his son beyond measure, gifting him a new property every birthday. I had no idea which one Albert considered his primary residence. But Albert's brows furrowed in displeasure. "What do you mean, which home?" "Our home, of course. We're dating, so shouldn't we live together? Wherever you are is where I'll go." Tears nearly sprang to my eyes. "I only have one bed. And I'm not your boyfriend." Albert studied me in silence for a moment before his lips curved into a confident smirk. "Who are you fooling? From the moment I laid eyes on you, I knew I'd like you." Standing up, he adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair, and declared with absolute certainty, "And why wouldn't you love me? I'm young, handsome, healthy, intelligent, and composed. You have no reason to resist." Then, with a mischievous tilt of his head, he pulled me to my feet and smiled. "We're obviously made for each other." I had never encountered anyone so infuriatingly unreasonable. Albert wrapped an arm around my shoulder, practically kidnapping me as he shoved me into the car. Refusing to let me take the wheel again, he slid into the driver's seat, and with the GPS guiding him, he sped through the streets like a race car driver, heading straight to my place. The moment we arrived at my shabby apartment complex, his expression soured. From the peeling paint on the walls to the rust-stained gates, he had a running commentary of complaints. When we stepped inside my cramped studio apartment, his dismay reached its peak. His gaze swept over the rusted security door, the tiny, cluttered room, and the pile of unwashed laundry slumped on the chair. This has to be the worst living environment I've ever seen," he muttered, looking around as though he'd stumbled into a war zone. "Can people even survive here?" I pressed my lips together, keeping my head down and saying nothing. This was the best I could afford. 6 months out of college, every penny I earned went back home to support a sick mother, a younger sister in school, and cover the debts left by my late father. My reality was one he could never understand. Some people were born with golden spoons in their mouths, while others like me had nothing but splinters. I sighed and tried to send him away. "Albert, let me take you somewhere else." No response. When I looked up, I froze. There he was, standing in my tiny bathroom, scrubbing my underwear with a vengeance under the faucet. His lips were pressed in a tight line, his expression equal parts annoyance and bewildering fondness. "I don't know what I was thinking," he muttered, sparing me a glance that was a mix of exasperation and a strange, almost indulgent softness. "But if I can put up with this level of poverty, it must mean I really do love you." I gawked as he wrung out the underwear, then brought it up to his nose with a casual sniff. "It's clean now. Smells pretty decent." My face burned bright red. "I'll hang it up myself," I stammered, rushing to grab it from him. But Albert smirked, holding it behind his back and leaning in with a mischievous gleam in his eye. "Nope. A kiss is payment for my hard work." I froze in place, my mind blank. He waited, tapping his foot impatiently. "Hurry up. Isn't this what we used to do?" I blinked at him, finally managing to stammer, "We definitely didn't." Albert's logic remained as broken as ever. He stared at me in disbelief. "You mean to tell me I just slaved over your laundry, and you can't even kiss me? Unbelievable. Where's the justice in this?" Grumbling, he hung the clothes himself, then plopped down on the only bed in the room, arms crossed, sulking like a child. Despite turning his back to me, his eyes darted in my direction every few seconds. I sighed, exasperated but unable to muster any anger. Just as I was about to walk over to placate him, my phone rang. It was the CEO. I quickly answered the phone. The CEO, currently on a business trip abroad, sounded groggy, clearly calling past his bedtime with the time difference. Through a yawn, he asked, "Charles, has Albert made it home yet?" I glanced at a certain someone sulking on my bed, and decided it was best to leave out the minor detail of the car crash. "He's home. Home at my place, to be exact." The so ever the trusting boss chuckled. "Good, I knew I could count on you. Take care of Albert for me. Put the company's tasks on hold if you need to. Prioritize my son. When I get back, I'll make sure you get a promotion and a raise." My spirits soared at those words. After hanging up, I noticed Albert was still sneakily watching me out of the corner of his eye. The moment he realized I wasn't paying him any attention, he dramatically pressed a hand to his forehead and groaned, "Ah, ow." I sighed and walked over to him, gently rubbing the bump on his head. "How are you feeling? Remember anything yet?" Albert's lips turned downward in a sulk. "Nope, nothing." Then, without warning, he grabbed my hand and pulled me down, making me land squarely on his lap. "You're in such a hurry to get rid of me, aren't you? Did we break up or something?" Before I could respond, he shook his head decisively. "No, that's impossible." His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment his ears turned a little red. He spoke softly, almost shyly. "I don't think I could ever bring myself to leave you." I froze, caught off guard by the sincerity in his eyes, and suddenly couldn't look at him. But I knew I had to clear things up, no matter how awkward it might get. "Albert, listen to me. You're the CEO's son. The only reason I was at the airport to pick you up is because your dad gave me the task. We don't have any other kind of relationship. If you don't believe me, call him yourself and ask." Albert fell silent for a long moment, flipping through his contacts on his phone. Eventually, his fingers stilled. He laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. "Charles, you must think I'm brain damaged and easy to fool. That's why you'd come up with such a ridiculous lie to trick me, isn't it?" "No, it's not like that," I protested, completely exasperated. How was I supposed to know that while the CEO bragged endlessly about his precious son at work, the two of them secretly had a falling out and even blocked each other? Albert wasn't listening anymore. He stood and trudged toward the door, his shoulders slumping, a few quiet tears sliding down his face. "I don't remember anything, and even you don't want me. Fine. I'm just a burden anyway. Believe." Let me fend for myself out there. I panicked. He was barely dressed for the winter night. If he wandered off and got lost or sick, the CEO would turn me into dumpling filling when he got back. I chased after him and grabbed his arm at the door, relenting. Come back inside. It's freezing out there, don't catch a cold. Albert immediately stopped and turned, a triumphant look spreading across his face. He stepped back in, shutting the door with a smirk. You're sweating bullets. Were you worried about me? He reached out to flick my nose, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Still saying I'm not your boyfriend? You're such a little liar. I sighed, utterly drained. Fine, whatever. Let him think what he wants. I'd just have to humor him for a few days. Once the CEO returned, he could deal with fixing Albert's head. Albert had officially moved into my place. My apartment, a cramped ground floor unit, had little natural light, feeble heating, and turned damp and freezing after every snowfall. The single bed was already a challenge in winter. I used to shiver for half an hour before finally falling asleep. But now, with Albert sharing the bed, his body radiating warmth like a furnace, I found myself unconsciously gravitating toward him. Wrapped in his heat, I could fall asleep almost instantly. He, however, didn't seem to sleep so well. Every morning, he'd wake up with noticeable dark circles under his eyes, and his gaze at me was sharp enough to cut steel. Were you cold last night? I asked nervously. No, he snapped. Was the bed too small, maybe? Too cramped? I bit my lip, feeling uneasy. I couldn't afford a second bed, and even if I could, there wasn't enough space in the apartment. If he really couldn't stand it, I'd have no choice but to sleep on the floor. But as my eyes drifted to the damp, icy floor, fretting over the thought, Albert suddenly grabbed me and pulled me into his arms. His grip tightened around my waist, and his hands slid lower, cupping me through my pants. His voice was husky as he growled, "Still pretending? Who was the one setting me on fire all night?" Before I could process his words, he gave a firm squeeze. My back arched instinctively, and I froze in place, too startled to move. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Albert smirked wickedly, his fingers slipping under the waistband of my pants as he leaned in to nip at my earlobe. Then let me have an accident too. His heated chest pressed against my back, his deft fingers roaming boldly over my body. I felt a sharp, embarrassing jolt run through me and sprang up as though electrocuted, my face burning red. Late. I'll be docked pay if I'm late. I stammered, bolting out of bed. Bundled in layers, I sped down the icy streets on my electric scooter, the freezing winter air doing little to cool my flushed cheeks. It was true, I'd always been into men. And Albert, with his strong build and unfairly perfect embrace, was exactly my type. But someone like him, a pampered, high-end mighty heir, was far beyond my reach. He wasn't even in the realm of possibility for me. I forced myself to focus, shaking off the haze of my irrational thoughts. You can't dream about things you can't have. By the time I reached the office, cheeks numb from the cold, I managed to clock in at the very last second. This was the miserable, unglamorous life of a corporate drone. A life I understood all too well. The CEO had a total of 8 assistants. There were those who accompanied him to meetings and business trips, others dedicated to networking and PR, and, of course, the ones skilled at shameless flattery. And then there was me, the one quietly handling all the grunt work. Anything the other assistants didn't want to do or couldn't flaunt in front of the CEO as credit-worthy ended up on my plate. Tonight was no different. After working overtime well past midnight, I was exhausted, starving, and barely able to keep my electric scooter moving under the weight of my laptop bag. Dragging my worn-out self home, I barely managed to unlock the door when someone suddenly pressed me against the entryway and kissed me. Albert Layton. He frowned, clearly displeased. Why are you so late? I pouted miserably. Too much work. His brows furrowed. Is everyone at your company working overtime? Of course not, I replied with a sigh. I'm the newbie, inexperienced. Doing more work is supposed to help me learn. Albert scoffed, a sharp sound of disbelief. Learn? More like being exploited. Which company is it? I'll post an anonymous complaint about it online. Your company. I stayed silent as Albert took my laptop bag off my shoulder and led me to the dining table. Never mind that. First. On the rickety wooden table sat 3 dishes and a soup, all made from the discount groceries I had picked up at the market. Yet somehow, Albert had turned them into a meal that looked and smelled delicious. You can cook? Best, surprised. Albert raised his chin proudly. Of course. Studying abroad for so many years. If I couldn't cook, I'd have starved to death. I chuckled, but then a thought struck me. Wait, you didn't eat yet? You've been waiting for me this whole time? He nodded matter-of-factly. As your boyfriend, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? He placed a tender piece of chicken wing on my plate, his tone soft. I'll find a job soon and start earning money. You won't have to work so hard anymore. I froze, staring at him in stunned silence. His words sank into my chest like the warm chicken soup on the table, spreading a comforting heat. You won't have to work so hard. It had been years since anyone said something like that to me. Feeling my eyes sting, I quickly ducked my head and focused on eating. Just as I was about to take another bite, a sudden knock at the door interrupted the quiet. Who is it? I called, setting down my chopsticks, puzzled. Who could be visiting this late? When I opened the door, a tall, strikingly beautiful woman stood there. She was draped in an expensive lambskin coat, her hair styled in perfect waves, and her gaze was as haughty as it was dismissive. Her eyes swept past me and scanned the room behind me. Albert is here, isn't he? She fixed me with a sharp look, her voice cold and commanding. I'm his girlfriend. It felt like a blow to the head, the sweet, fleeting daydream I just indulged in shattered completely. The woman standing before me wasn't a stranger. I'd seen her twice before, Shirley Miller, heiress to the Miller Group. No wonder she seemed so familiar with the CEO at the banquet. It all made sense now. She wasn't just anyone, she was his son's girlfriend. Snapping out of my daze, I forced a polite smile and quickly invited her in. Albert, someone's here for you. Albert, who had been tidying up the dining table, turned toward us. His gaze landed on Shirley, and for a moment he looked genuinely taken aback. Shirley's eyes reddened as she rushed forward and threw herself into his arms. What are you doing here? Do you know how worried I've been? Albert stiffened, his arms awkwardly raised in surrender as if trying to avoid touching her. His expression was a mix of confusion and discomfort. Sorry, but who are you? Shirley's face darkened, and she smacked his shoulder with indignation. Who am I? I'm the girl you grew up with, your childhood sweetheart. In kindergarten, you promised to marry me one day. And now you've forgotten me? Unbelievable. Albert turned his puzzled eyes to me, his confusion deepening. But I'm pretty sure I like guys. I nearly choked on air and interrupted his nonsense, grabbing the plates and utensils from his hands. I'll wash these. You two should talk. Thank goodness for the small kitchen with its glass door. I slipped inside, happy to escape the scene. They could have their little reunion without me playing the third wheel. Cold water splashed over the plates as I scrubbed them clean, the warmth and comfort of just minutes ago fading as if it had been nothing but a fleeting illusion. Through the slightly ajar door, I caught glimpses of their interaction. Shirley was clearly unimpressed, her sharp gaze sweeping over the small, shabby apartment. She made no attempt to sit, likely fearing the old chairs might sully her elegant clothes. Albert stood beside her, leaning in slightly, his expression serious as he listened to whatever she was saying. I couldn't hear the specifics of their conversation, but one thing was undeniable: they looked like they belonged together. She was a poised, refined heiress, and he, the perfect gentleman by her side. Picture-perfect match, the very definition of a couple born for each other. Feeling a pang of something I didn't want to name, I shrank back into the kitchen. My fingers fidgeted with the edges of a plate as I stared blankly at the sink, suddenly aware of how much I resembled the servant in an ancient tale, standing guard while the young master secretly met his lover. After what felt like an eternity, the kitchen door suddenly opened. Albert stood there, his gaze dropping to my fingers, which were on the verge of being picked raw. He frowned. Are you low on vitamins? Tomorrow, I'll fry up some carrots for you to fix that. I glanced past him toward the living room. Did Miss Miller leave? Why didn't you go with her? Albert leaned against the doorframe, his tone calm as he explained, "Shirley Miller isn't my girlfriend. I just asked her. No engagement, no relationship, nothing. It was just a joke from childhood. At best, we were close friends." I exhaled softly, a wave of relief washing over me for reasons I couldn't quite name. In a quiet voice, I said, "Even so, you should have left with her. Clearly, the two of you are much closer." Albert hesitated, his brows furrowing slightly. After a long pause, he murmured, "But I don't remember her. Everything she says feels so unfamiliar to me." He raised a hand to his forehead, rubbing it as if trying to knock the answers loose. His voice was a mix of frustration and helplessness. "I really can't remember. Everyone keeps trying to tell me who I am, but no matter how hard I think, my mind stays blank." He looked up, his careful gaze locking onto mine. "When I woke up, the only person I saw was you." His tone grew even softer, tinged with vulnerability. "Charles, are you absolutely sure we're not lovers?" I froze at the sight of his uncertain expression, a strange ache blooming in my chest. But I couldn't lie to him. Biting my lip, I replied firmly, "We're not." Albert's eyes lowered, his long lashes casting delicate shadows over his cheeks like little fans. He pressed a hand to his chest and muttered, almost inaudibly, "Then why does it feel like I really, really like you?" The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant howl of the winter wind slipping through the cracks of the old windows. My heart pounded like a wild drum, its rhythm so loud I thought he might hear it. Before I could stop myself, I opened my arms and gave him a gentle, comforting pat on the back. "When your memory comes back, you won't have to feel this way anymore." Albert rested his chin on my shoulder, his voice muffled but filled with a kind of raw honesty. "These past few days, I've been clinging to you. Are you tired of me yet?" I quickly shook my head. "No, of course not." Tentatively, he wrapped his arms around my waist, as if afraid I might push him away. "Then, can I stay here? Just a little longer?" I nodded emphatically. "Of course you can." Albert was still living with me, sharing the same bed and the same blanket. It wasn't like I had any extra blankets to offer, and in the middle of the night, seeking warmth, we'd unconsciously huddle closer. By morning, I'd always end up snug in his arms. His arm, hot and firm, would slowly release its grip around my waist as he groggily reached for his clothes to cover up the morning's awkwardness. "Sorry," he said, his tone far more polite these days. My ears burned as I scrambled out of bed, slipping into my slippers and fleeing to the bathroom. Cold water on my face and an unnecessary amount of tissues later, I managed to compose myself. After breakfast, Albert rode his small electric scooter to drop me off at work. Stopping in front of the towering Leighton Tech building, he glanced up, his gaze lingering on the massive structure. Slowly, he read the name aloud, Leighton Tech? I watched him carefully. "Does it feel familiar? Did you remember something?" He shook his head, a faint scowl creasing his brow. "I don't really like this place. Go on, you'll be late. Get inside." With a wave of his hand, he turned the scooter around and drove off without a second thought, not lingering a moment longer than necessary. As I swiped my badge at the entrance, the security guard grabbed my arm, eyes wide. "Charles Williams, was that the young master from the Leighton family just now?" I tightened my grip on my laptop bag and nodded awkwardly. The guard's jaw nearly hit the floor. "Is the company going bankrupt? The heir of the Leighton family is riding a scooter?" Panicking, I rushed to correct him. No, the company's doing great." But that only made things worse. "Then, you two are together? Like, the prince gave up everything to move in with the poor Cinderella?" My face turned beet red. "Stop. Please, just pretend you didn't see anything, okay?" The guard smirked knowingly, zipping his lips with a gesture, but the damage was done. Before the morning was over, the company's break room was buzzing with exaggerated versions of the story. "Did you hear? Leighton's heir personally dropped Charles Williams off this morning. They were practically glued to each other at the entrance. Word is they couldn't bear to part. Leighton kissed Charles multiple times before reluctantly leaving. I saw it with my own eyes. Charles was batting his lashes, all coy and seductive. Leighton nearly lost control right there. I couldn't take it anymore. The rumors got more absurd with every retelling, and no matter where I went, my coworkers greeted me with teasing smirks and raised eyebrows. I wished I could melt into the walls and disappear. Not bad, came a mocking voice. Verna Blackwell, one of the senior assistants, tossed a stack of files onto my desk, arms crossed. You actually managed to snag the young master. Impressive. Verna was the queen of flattery and backhanded compliments, famous for tattling to the CEO to curry favor. I pressed my lips into a thin line. Ms. Blackwell, it's a misunderstanding. I'm not close with Albert. She snorted derisively. You'd better not be. Drop whatever silly ambitions you have, you're not in his league. Her gaze swept over me, her disdain painfully obvious. Know your place. With a click of her heels, she added, organize those files into a PowerPoint and send it to me ASAP. The CO is waiting. Yes, ma'am, I mumbled, swallowing my frustration as I buried myself in work. Being the least experienced assistant with no connections, I had no choice but to endure. Just as I was getting into the groove, the office erupted in chatter. Verna clasped a hand over her mouth, her eyes gleaming with delight. Human Resources just got Albert Leighton's resume. The young master is joining the company. While I was still focused on work, Albert casually strolled over, waving at me through the glass window of the office. Verna Blackwell, seated not far from me, mistakenly thought the greeting was for her. She lit up with enthusiasm and hurried to intercept him. Mr. Leighton, is there anything I can help you with? Albert didn't even spare her a glance and walked right past, heading directly to my desk. It's almost time to clock out. Want to head home together? He asked. I glanced at the half-finished PowerPoint on my screen and hesitated. You go ahead. I still have some work to finish. He clicked his tongue in annoyance. This isn't the project you were following yesterday. Who dumped this on you? Verna's face visibly paled, and Albert's sharp eyes zeroed in on her. Whoever's work this is should handle it themselves, he said coldly, his brow furrowing. If your company's assistants can't even manage clear task distribution, maybe the structure is too bloated. I'll make sure to bring up this issue with the appropriate people soon. Verna's face turned stark white. She hurriedly grabbed the unfinished files from my desk, her tone hurried and conciliatory. Charles Williams, you should head out early. I'll take care of the rest. Thanks for your help. Sitting on the back seat of Albert's electric scooter moments later, I still felt like I was dreaming. I thought you didn't like Leighton Tech? I asked, my voice carried by the wind. He gave a nonchalant hum. I don't. But you work there. I wanted to be closer to you. I opened my mouth to reply but found myself speechless, unsure of how to respond. The ride home was quiet, the winter air biting. When we reached the apartment complex, Albert parked the scooter and handed me a freshly roasted sweet potato he'd picked up from a nearby vendor. Its warmth seeped into my hands, chasing away the chill. Charles, he said softly, his head slightly bowed, his gaze fixed somewhere below mine. Don't feel pressured. He hesitated, then continued, his voice laced with earnestness. I want to be good to you. I want to be close to you. It's instinct, something I can't control. It has nothing to do with who I am, and I don't expect anything in return. Could you not push me away? He exhaled, his breath visible in the icy air. Give me a chance to pursue you. His ears were red from the cold, his thick lashes damp from the fog, trembling slightly like a butterfly unsure of its wings. The sight stirred something soft and unexplainable in my chest. My face flushed as I bumped his arm gently. Aren't you cold? Let's head inside. Albert looked up, his eyes sparkling with a newfound light, his lips curving into a beautiful smile. Gripping my hand tightly, he beamed like a child clutching a prized candy. Let's go home. Albert hadn't forgotten to stand up for me. That night, he transformed into a self-proclaimed prosecutor, drafting a fiery email condemning the company's overtime culture, its exploitation of new employees, and its overall toxic work environment. He sent it straight to the CEO's inbox. The response was swift, a 2,000-word reply brimming with sincerity from the CEO himself. Albert, clearly satisfied, leaned back with a pleased expression. Not bad. This boss knows how to take feedback and fix mistakes. I like him. From then on, he threw himself into observing the company's inefficiencies with great enthusiasm, filing one report after another. His efforts were rewarded with praise from the CEO, and he even ended up assisting HR in implementing a series of reforms. After that, Verna Blackwell never dared to dump her work on me again, though the resentment in her glare was palpable. Well, she sneered one day. You've really latched onto a big tree, haven't you? Let's see how long your glory lasts. I had no words for her, only an awkward, guilty smile. Later, when I received a phone call from the CO, I hid in a bathroom stall, sweat dripping down my back. Charles, I hear you've been getting along well with Albert lately, the CO began. Frantically, I wiped my forehead. No, sir. Just rumors, nothing more. The CO paused, his tone turning somber. I only have one son, Charles. I'm truly worried he might go astray. My heart clenched as if struck by a heavy blow. I'm sorry, Mr. Layton. But the CO sighed deeply, his voice carrying over from the other side of the ocean. Before Albert's accident, he insisted on becoming a race car driver. We fought bitterly, he refused to back down. But now, after hitting his head, he's suddenly willing to take over the company. Charles, you've done a great service, the CO exclaimed, his tone growing more animated. From now on, you're Albert's personal assistant. Keep him on track at work, take care of him at home, and give him whatever he wants. When I return, I'll give you a hefty bonus. What? The sudden shift in tone left me reeling. You're not mad at me, sir? Mad at you? The CO laughed heartily. This is a blessing in disguise. Who cares about a bump on the head if he's finally taking responsibility for the company? Charles, my son is in your hands now. I trust you completely. Next month, you'll get a raise, and your year-end bonus will double. Swallowing all the self-reflection I'd prepared, I clenched my fist with newfound determination. Mr. Layton, you can count on me. Truth be told, though, it felt like everything about my life now depended on Albert. He drove me to and from work every day on his little electric scooter, cooked meals, and kept the apartment spotless. Within 2 months, he'd managed to pamper me into gaining a soft layer of weight. At night, as we slipped under the covers, Albert would pinch the newly formed softness around my waist. Not bad, he teased. Finally doesn't feel bony. His playful touch sent shivers through me, and I pushed his wandering hands away, pressing my lips together nervously. Albert, is there anything you want? The CEO's words echoed in my mind. Whatever his son wanted, I was supposed to give. Orders were orders, and the rewards were too generous to ignore. Albert, oblivious to this behind-the-scenes arrangement, shifted closer in the dark, his intense gaze locking onto mine. Slowly, a fire sparked in his eyes. Anything? He asked, his voice low and steady. I nodded. Leaning in, he gently brushed his nose against mine, his tone soft but resolute. Then give me a title. Can I have that? The faint scent of his body wash lingered in the air, the same one I used, yet somehow intoxicating on him. My face burned, and I avoided his gaze. Isn't there anything else you want? Albert's lips quirked into a smile before capturing mine in a soft but demanding kiss. Oh, I only want you. Perhaps our relationship had always been too blurry, too close for comfort. There was no normal boundary left between us. If not lovers, then what could we be? Hey. I wrapped my arms around his neck, leaning into the kiss as I shyly whispered, Husband. Albert's eyes darkened instantly, his kiss deepening with an urgency that left me breathless, as though he wanted to consume me whole. I clung to him tightly, pressing every inch of my skin against his, seeking the heat of his touch to chase away the lingering fears and insecurities buried deep inside me. If I'd never had him, I wouldn't fear losing him. But Albert and I were like two fleeting intersecting lines, destined to part ways eventually. Until the dream ends, hold me tighter. New Year's Eve arrived in the blink of an eye. While Albert and I were cooking dinner, his phone rang. He stepped away to answer, and when he returned, his brows were furrowed in annoyance. Some guy claiming to be my dad invited me home for dinner. My chest tightened. Are you leaving? He didn't answer immediately, shoving the recently purchased oil and a suspiciously small package into the bedside drawer. Finally, with a sullen expression, he muttered, "Yeah." My eyes stung. "Can't you skip it?" Pulling out his phone, he opened a navigation app. "I have to go. From the sound of it, the place is a mansion. It'd be a waste not to enjoy at least one meal there." I fiddled with my fingers nervously, mumbling, "Will you come back?" Albert pulled a scarf and hat from the wardrobe, carefully placing them on my head. "Of course. Unless you want me to spend the night there?" I blinked, stunned. "Am I going to?" He chuckled. "Aren't you my boyfriend? Obviously, you're coming with me." And, he added, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly, "My memory's still not back. What if I can't even recognize my own dad? That'd be way too embarrassing. You've gotta come for moral support." 1 hour later, the CEO himself was standing at the gates of a grand mansion, waiting. From afar, his expression grew increasingly perplexed as a tiny electric scooter slowly trundled into the upscale villa district. Albert stepped off the scooter, removed his helmet, and greeted the man with a serious expression. "Dad." Then, from the scooter's basket, he pulled out a bag of cornbread and offered it to the CEO. Didn't want to show up empty-handed. "It's not much, but it's the thought that counts. Hope you don't mind." The CEO took the bag, staring at it as if it were an alien artifact. His gaze darted between Albert and me, his confusion mounting. While Albert parked the scooter, the CEO pulled me aside and whispered, "Charles, is my son's brain really that damaged?" I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, sweat pooling in my palms. Forcing a nervous laugh, I replied, "His intelligence is intact, sir. It doesn't affect his work or daily life." The CEO sighed heavily, patting my shoulder before slipping a wad of cash into my pocket. "You've worked hard." Mortified, I tried to refuse. "No need, Mr. Layton." Albert appeared just in time, pressing my hand over the cash. "If Dad's giving it to you, take it. It's only right to show appreciation when the daughter-in-law visits for the first time." The CEO's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "What?" Albert wrapped an arm around my shoulder and declared boldly, "This is my partner." The CEO stumbled back a step, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Charles, you told me it was all just rumors. Is this how you've been taking care of my son?" Shame heated my face as I buried half of it into my scarf. "I'm sorry, Mr. Layton." "Dad, stop scaring him," Albert grumbled, pulling me closer. He seemed unusually familiar with the mansion, confidently guiding me to the front door. Using an iris scanner, he unlocked the entrance and strode into the living room with the ease of someone who belonged there. "Is dinner ready?" "I'm starving." "All you think about is eating," the CEO grumbled, though his tone betrayed a mix of exasperation and indulgence. "Yes, it's ready. I even had the staff prepare all your favorite dishes." I sat at the dining table nervously, while Albert shamelessly piled food onto my plate. "Eat up," he whispered in my ear. "This meal's worth at least a month of both our salaries. Every bite's a profit." "Did you remember your dad?" I asked quietly. Albert paused mid-bite, taking a moment to discreetly glance at the sea. "Not really," he admitted before sinking his teeth into a piece of lobster. "But he seems really familiar. I feel like I want to be close to him, so we probably had a good relationship." He carried himself naturally, calling his father's dad with ease and even engaging in a serious discussion about the company's future. But the CEO's expression grew more and more peculiar as the evening progressed. After dinner, the housekeeper began clearing the table, and the CEO turned to Albert with a somber expression. "You haven't been home in years. Go upstairs and visit the memorial corner. Spend some time with your mom." The living room was quiet, leaving only the CEO and me. I sat on the edge of my seat, nervously rubbing the fabric of my pants, fully expecting him to toss me a black card and demand that I leave Albert's life for good. But he didn't. Instead, he sipped his tea and spoke in a low, reflective voice. "When Albert's mother passed away, I was too busy with work to make it back in time. He's hated me ever since. And not just me, he despised the company I poured my soul into building. I sent him to the best Ivy League schools, grooming him to take over as the next generation. But he rebelled, determined to spite me by becoming a race car driver instead. I scolded him harshly, and that brat blocked me. For years, he wouldn't even call me Dad. I listened, stunned, unsure of how to respond. The CEO gave me a pointed look. For 20 years, I couldn't convince him. Yet for you, he's willing to come back to the company. What exactly does he see in you? My face burned with shame and I lowered my head. I don't know. I don't think I deserve him. The CEO waved dismissively. Enough with the modesty. If he's this crazy about you even when you don't deserve him, imagine if you did. He'd probably stage a coup to make you his king. He sighed deeply, a mix of exasperation and resignation. But I've come to terms with it. As long as he's happy, that's all that matters. Take care of him, will you? Before I could reply, Albert came downstairs, glancing toward the kitchen. Done talking? Dad, can the housekeeper pack up the leftover lobster? You can't possibly finish it all yourself. The CEO scowled. Take it all. You may as well move the entire house back with you. Albert mumbled. There's something we don't have at home. What's that? The CEO asked, tossing a set of sports car keys in his direction. Take your precious car while you're at it. Albert tossed them back without hesitation. No thanks. Too flashy, it might attract thieves. Besides, I don't like racing anymore. We rode back home on the scooter, the night air biting against my cheeks. Did my dad give you a hard time? Albert asked. No, I replied, recounting the CEO's words verbatim. Albert paused, looking thoughtful. I must have been such a rebellious jerk before I lost my memory. After a brief moment of reflection, he changed into his pajamas and urged me to shower with him. While the bathroom filled with steam, Albert leaned down to nibble my ear. After New Year's, how about I meet your family? I blushed deeply. The truth was, I'd already let it slip over the phone. My mother, too frail to care, had shrugged it off, and my sister, always a romantic, was over the moon. They'd both given their blessing. Under the soft glow of the bathroom light, I looked into Albert's earnest, expectant eyes and couldn't stop myself from tilting my face up to kiss him. For a moment, happiness felt within reach, close enough to grasp. Albert's breaths grew heavier as he hastily dried me off, then carried me to the bed, wrapped in a towel. Pulling out a fresh supply of items from the bedside drawer, he grinned cheekily. This time, I bought in bulk. Enough to last us 6 months. My face turned scarlet. So this was the something you said we didn't have at home? He nodded seriously. Yeah. I've never done this before. I'm a rookie. A warning bell rang in my head. A rookie meant no sense of restraint. And I was right. Once things started, he lost all sense of control. His strength was relentless, his passion boundless. By the time it was over, I was hoarse from crying out, trembling and utterly spent. No more. Let me rest. I tried to crawl away, legs wobbling like jelly. Albert, ever insistent, pushed me back toward the bed's headboard, only for me to tumble off the side in exhaustion. Careful. He dove to catch me, hitting his head on the corner of the bedside table with a loud thud. Panic surged through me as I scrambled over to check on him. Are you okay? Albert rubbed his forehead and slowly sat up. But when he opened his eyes, they were cold and unfamiliar. Who are you? My heart sank, ice spreading through my veins. You don't remember me? I shouldn't be here, he murmured, glancing around the room. His gaze landed on our bare bodies and the used wrappers in the trash can. His expression froze. For a long moment, he said nothing, veins pulsing at his temples as he silently dressed. I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight, sweat still clinging to his skin. I'll compensate you. As he moved toward the door, my voice broke in desperation. Albert. He paused, one hand on the doorknob, barely turning his head. I couldn't see his face, but I could sense his urgency to leave. Swallowing my plea to make him stay, I whispered instead, dry off your sweat. Don't catch a cold. He hesitated, nodded faintly, and walked out, the rusty door slamming shut behind him. Left alone, I collapsed onto the cold floor. Outside, the winter wind howled, leaving my chest hollow and exposed. After what felt like hours, I dragged myself back to the disheveled bed, curling into the lingering warmth he'd left behind. I had to sleep. Tomorrow was another workday, and corporate drones like me didn't have the luxury of indulgence. Albert regained his memory, but in doing so, he forgot about me. He seemed puzzled about why he was working at the company he once despised, yet he didn't quit. Instead, he dutifully pushed forward with his projects, taking his responsibilities seriously. However, whenever he saw me, his private assistant, there was an undeniable awkwardness. Word of our prior relationship had spread among the staff, and the stories of his over-the-top, love-struck behavior left him visibly baffled. The very idea that he'd been involved with another man seemed utterly incomprehensible to him. I could sense his discomfort, the way he avoided me, even though he was too polite to tell me to leave. Not wanting to make things harder for him, I proactively applied to transfer back to the CEO's assistant team. The CEO called me in for a private conversation. "Charles, have you and Albert really broken things off?" Suppressing the ache in my chest, I nodded. The CEO sighed, a mixture of frustration and regret on his face. "That brat. First he hits his head, then he stirs up all this drama. What a mess he's made of things. It's like he's toying with people." I pressed my lips together, forcing out the words quietly, "It's all right, Mr. Layton. He and I were never meant to be. We're from two different worlds and should never have crossed paths." But every time I returned to my dim, damp apartment, cooking instant noodles on an empty stomach or tossing and turning under the cold, lifeless blankets, I couldn't help but think of him. I missed the way he'd move around the kitchen in an apron, the warmth of his body against mine, the way he'd protect and cherish me, and the countless times he'd said, "I like you." If I'd never known warmth, I wouldn't fear the cold. Lying on my side, facing the spot where Albert used to sleep, tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. "Albert, I hate you." The first business banquet of the new year arrived, with Albert and the CEO attending together. Shirley Miller, the heiress who had once shown up at my apartment looking for Albert, was also there. She looped her arm through his, chatting with him affectionately as they navigated the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with the elite of the business world. With his memory restored, Albert's gaze toward Shirley was softer, his demeanor more polished and composed. He smiled often, a perfect gentleman, exuding charm. It wasn't the Albert the first had known. The Albert I'd known had meticulously planned our meals to stretch our budget, crouched in supermarket aisles waiting for discounts, and haggled animatedly with vendors at the market. I had dragged him down to my level. Those few short months together must have been nothing more than a blemish on his otherwise pristine life. Sighing, I stood outside by the car with the driver, absent-mindedly poking at the snow in the landscaping. When I looked up, my gaze met Albert's from across the courtyard. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something unreadable before he quickly looked away, resuming his conversation. At the entrance, he said polite goodbyes to the guests and hugged Shirley lightly. They seemed to be setting a date for their next meeting. Lowering my head, I rubbed my aching legs. Perhaps I had imagined it. There was no way Albert still saw me at all. As time passed, my coworkers began to notice the growing distance between Albert and me. "So, you two broke up already?" Verna Blackwell sneered one day, her voice dripping with mockery. "Of course," another chimed in. "Albert Layton isn't someone you hold on to for long. He's way out of your league. Shirley Miller is a much better match." Back when Albert had been fighting my corner, he'd filed multiple complaints about Verna to the CEO. Now, she was itching for revenge. She conveniently took a leave of absence during a tough negotiation, forcing me to accompany the CEO to a dinner meeting with a particularly demanding client. The client was a heavy drinker. By the end of the night, I had drunk enough to turn my lips white, excused myself to vomit twice in the restroom, and nearly passed out. "I'm fine. Just get Charles home first," I vaguely heard the CEO say before someone came in to help me up and splash water on my face. "Can you walk?" a familiar voice asked. The sound was like a lifeline, pulling me back from my haze. Without thinking, I whimpered, "No? Carry me, husband." The person froze, then hesitantly placed a hand on my head, stopping me from nuzzling against his chest. After a moment's pause, he scooped me up. I wrapped my arms around his neck, clinging to his warmth, my drunken mind lost to reality. When we reached my apartment, I only grew clingier, clutching him tightly and sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't leave, Albert. Don't go. The mere scent of him had tears streaming down my face, memories flooding back. Pressing my cheek against his sleeve, I wrinkled his perfectly pressed shirt with my desperate grip. He said nothing for a long time. Then, with a soft sigh, he lay down beside me, pulling me into his arms like he used to, holding me securely. Sleep. I'm here, he murmured. The next morning, I woke to find myself clean, dressed, and alone. He was gone, leaving no trace behind. I couldn't tell if last night had been Albert's fleeting act of indulgence, or if I'd simply dreamed it all in the depths of my longing. Since that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. It was there when I made coffee in the break room, when I bought roasted sweet potatoes at the street corner. Even at night, as I pulled the curtains before bed, I thought I saw a figure standing by the bushes under the streetlight. A tall, silent silhouette. The orange glow of a cigarette flared faintly between his fingers as he stood there, head lowered, seemingly lost in thought. He didn't move or make a sound, blending seamlessly into the darkness around him. When the cigarette burned out, he flicked it into the trash and disappeared without a trace. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked again. Nothing. Just the faint yellow blooms of early jasmine in the bushes. Maybe it had all been a figment of my imagination. I'd officially caught the lovesick bug. Every shadow, every glance, every flicker of light, it all reminded me of Albert Layton. But Albert wasn't some creep with nothing better to do than follow me around, was he? No, this was ridiculous. If I kept spiraling like this, my heartbreak was going to morph into full-blown madness. It was time to move on. Time to start a new chapter. In the spirit of fresh beginnings, I decided to venture out. Somewhere new, somewhere bold, a gay bar. The moment I stepped in, my eyes widened at the scene before me. Hey, handsome, care to dance? Your lips look so kissable. Playing alone is no fun. Why not come home with me? Within the first hour, I'd been offered over a dozen drinks. Dizzy and overwhelmed, I found myself dragged onto the dance floor, bouncing from one crowd to another. At some point, a few hands got a little too familiar, groping places they had no business touching. Seriously? Was everyone here so uninhibited? No wonder everyone else managed to find boyfriends. Meanwhile, I was single and spiraling. This only made me more emo. Dejected, I decided it was time to leave. But just as I turned to go, my unsteady feet wobbled, and I stumbled straight into someone's solid chest. Whoa there, little guy. Can't get enough of me? The stranger grinned, sliding an arm around me and leaning down as if to kiss me. You're so pretty. For reasons I couldn't explain, despite being attracted to men, the thought of kissing this one made my stomach churn with disgust. Don't touch me. I twisted my head away, struggling with all my might to escape his grip. Let me go. My feeble attempts were laughable at best, but the man suddenly hissed in pain and let go. Before I could process what was happening, I found myself swept into another pair of arms, a broad, warm embrace that carried a scent so achingly familiar it made my breath catch. I looked up in shock. Albert? He didn't answer, his fiery gaze fixed on the man across from us. He's mine, Albert growled, his voice low and dangerous. Back off. I had never seen Albert this furious. Half the alcohol in my system seemed to evaporate instantly. He hauled me into his car, gripping my arm like a vice, his face as stormy as a winter sky. I slumped in the seat, fiddling nervously with my fingers, too scared to meet his icy gaze. Quite the move, Albert snapped. Going to a gay bar. I mumbled under my breath, I am gay. Albert's head whipped around, his expression darkening further. And what were you trying to do? Find a new boyfriend? A one-night stand? His words stung. Both hurt and defensive, I retorted, why do you care? His breath hitched, the air between us growing tense. We never broke up, he hissed. Did I say we were done? Did I? I blinked, hope sparking faintly in my chest. Ooh, remember me? I asked tentatively. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes as he cleared his throat. Oh. But, Albert hesitated, his voice softening. Every time I see you, my heart races. I can't stop looking at you. I want to be near you, to protect you. In my memories, I don't know you. We've barely met as far as I can tell. But my heart keeps whispering, I like you. I like you. I like you. I even asked strangers online, and they said it sounds like love at first sight. I stared at him, dumbfounded. The rest of the alcohol evaporated completely. So the figure lurking near my apartment recently, was that really you? Albert had the decency to look slightly sheepish. Yes, it was me. His fingers brushed against the back of my hand. When I didn't pull away, he grew bolder, taking my entire hand into his warm grasp. I couldn't help myself. I had to see you. But when I saw you with another man, it felt like my mind was being blown apart by missiles. Every ounce of rationality was gone. Charles, please, don't date anyone else. My heart fluttered, a smile tugging uncontrollably at my lips. I lowered my head, unable to hide my happiness. Then who should I date? I teased. Albert cupped my chin, tilting my face up so I could meet his intense gaze. Me. I couldn't hold back the goofy grin spreading across my face. Handsome, your lips look really kissable, I quipped, leaning forward to press my lips softly against his. Albert's eyes darkened as he slid a hand to the back of my head, pulling me closer to deepen the kiss. Before he could, the car suddenly jolted violently. Both of us yelped as our foreheads collided with a loud thud. Sorry. I hit the car's bumper. A flustered driver called out, running over to check on us. Rubbing my aching head, I waved it off and immediately turned to Albert, worried. Are you okay? His forehead was a little red, and he stared at me, dazed and silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his gaze shifted, his expression complicated. He stammered. My ears buzzed, and my face drained of color. Albert, I whispered, my voice trembling, don't tell me you forgot me again. Tears pricked at my eyes as panic set in. Please, don't joke like this. No. Albert surged forward, pulling me tightly into his arms, his hands soothingly running through my hair. I remember everything now, he murmured, his voice trembling with conviction. And I'll never forget again. Charles, whether I remember or forget, I'll fall in love with you every single time. Don't be afraid. Relief and joy coursed through me in overwhelming waves, making my heart race wildly. I clung to Albert's shoulder, sobbing softly as I listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When I finally calmed down, Albert gently asked, "What did you call me earlier?" Sniffling, I replied, "Handsome, big brother." Albert froze, his lips twitching as he fell into silence. Realizing how corny it sounded, I flushed with embarrassment. "I won't call you that again, I promise." To my surprise, Albert let out a dramatic sigh, his tone full of exaggerated grievance. "Do you know how hard it was for me to earn that title? Now it's gone again because of a bump to the head. Being forgetful really ruins things." "What title?" I asked, confused. "Don't call me brother," he said, a glint of mischief returning to his eyes. "Call me husband." The shameless Albert was back, leaning in with puckered lips. "No more tears. Kiss your husband?" Our moment was interrupted by a knock on the window. The apologetic driver from earlier stood there awkwardly. "Sorry again. Do you need me to call your insurance company?" Albert waved him off. "No need. I've got urgent matters to attend to. The car can wait." Curious, I asked, "What urgent matters?" Albert's expression turned comically serious. "The bedside drawer at home is stocked with 2 full trays of supplies. If we don't use them soon, they'll expire. Waste is a sin." "What?" The sleek sports car sped through the crisp night air, eventually weaving its way into the narrow alleyways of our old neighborhood. The cold, dim apartment soon overflowed with warmth once again. Albert's fiery passion left me utterly spent, my body trembling as I lay on the bed. Through heavy-lidded eyes, I caught sight of the vibrant yellow jasmine blooms outside the window, branches brimming with life. Spring had arrived. The end.
Thanks for stopping by. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos.